So, continuing on with the nervous system here in chapter 13. So, now that we know the basic way that the nervous tissue communicates, right, through action potentials, we can talk about how we actually get interpretation and integration. And this really comes down to the areas of the brain. So, when an action potential is an action potential is an action potential, the end result, right, sensation, perception, interpretation, is due to where those action potentials go to in the central nervous system and where they come from in the central nervous system. So, just to remind you, again, the two divisions, peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. Neurons delivering information to the brain are the sensory, that's a sensory division of the peripheral, and it's also called the afferent. And neurons that carry information away from the brain is the motor, they're the responders, and that's also called the efferent. We know how an action potential starts, all right? It starts with some sort of stimulus that causes a electrical change that reaches threshold. Okay, so let's put that together here. Now, this first part of this chapter in OpenStax does talk a little bit about the development of the nervous system, which we're not going to, again, test or dwell on, but it is important to remind you, and later on when you take A&P2, we'll talk again about development towards the end of that class. So I say, let's start at the beginning. You will better appreciate the relationships of these areas of the brain if you think about this, right? You start as a straight line, major regions appear. Around 16 days after you're conceived, there are 3 distinct germ layers, and this we brought up in the chapter 4 on tissues, right? Endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. I said here from the neuroectoderm, so ectoderm in general differentiates into a neuroectoderm. We have a neural plate that then progresses to a groove, goes from a flat to a groove, right? And this happens on the back or posterior surface of the embryo. And the groove folds, and the folds unite, and this is what we call the neural tube. So if you've ever heard of a neural tube defect, it has to do with interruption in this process. A child that develops this tends to have a variety of possible outcomes depending on where the tube did not fuse. This is just below the ectoderm, so it's nicely shown in this cartoon. This is time, across time. So neural plate, neural crest, ectoderm, again, not for testing purposes, just to give you a little bit of background about how you all developed and came to be what you are. So about 25 days, the anterior, right, the front develops into a brain, and the posterior becomes a spinal cord. All right, so this is that folded, right, from a lateral side view. Here we are just looking down upon this, and here's 3 to 4 weeks, here's 5 weeks, so 35 days, here's about the 21 to 28 day. So I say it kind of resembles the formation of a balloon animal. There's these vesicles, right, so these large structures, containers that form. So on the anterior end, right, which is going to become your head, you have these 3 primary vesicles named for their positions, and they contain this root word encephalon, which means inside the head. So the prosencephalon, right, this is the forebrain, the mes is middle, and the rhomb is the hindbrain. And it's named, again, mostly for the shape here. These 3 primaries, right, pros, mes, and rhombs, become 5 secondaries. The proencephalon becomes a telencephalon, which will become the cerebrum, the diencephalon, which remains with us, right? We still call that the diencephalon. 2, the midbrain remains, and then the rhombencephalon becomes the metaencephalon, which gives rise to the pons and cerebellum. And then the myelencephalon, which becomes the medulla. All right, so again, just for your information, not going to ask you about neural development. All right? Spinal cord pretty much does not change in shape. It's a long straight cord with small space in the center, which is going to become the central canal. The cells that are the wall of the neural tube differentiate into neurons and glial cells. The dorsal part become sensory, and the ventral part, right, so it all depends on where you're at. The dorsal part becomes a sensory, the ventral part becomes a motor, and the ventricles are remnants of the hollow neural tube. So we still have that to this day. All right, now for the stuff that we really are going to test on. All right, the cerebrum. So postnatal brain, after you're born, is 4 major regions. Cerebrum, diencephalon, again, still retains that embryological developmental stage name, brainstem, and cerebellum. Okay, so the cerebrum, as we talk about here, is really the bulk of what we consider the brain, and it's divided into 2 hemispheres by this longitudinal fissure. It in this part of the brain, we experience learning, or can do learning, memory, emotion, consciousness, and behaviors. It is subdivided into gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is the cortex, and cortex means bark, so it's on the outer as we look at the actual sheep brains and think about this. And then within the brain tissue, the cerebrum, there are nuclei. So these are clusters of neuronal cell bodies, unmyelinated parts of the neuron. Nuclei. And this includes ones like the limbic system, the basal nuclei, and the basal forebrain. Features of the cerebrum are the hemispheres, the corpus callosum, which is going to join the two, and we'll see this in a different view in a little bit. Gyra, which are the bulges, or hills, I like to call them. Sulci, which are the valleys or grooves. So the grooves are the sulci. And then fissures, if it's a very deep groove. And we only have a few fissures, but we have lots and lots of sulci. All right. This shows the cerebral cortex divided up broadly into the lobes, and the lobes do reflect the bones over them. So using the gyri and sulci to landmark this, the 4 major regions or lobes, frontal, right, shown here in this kind of reddish orange, is primary motor. So most of your, again, skeletal muscle, right, all those actions we just got through learning are controlled from this part of the brain. So voluntary motor functions. Upper motor neurons are found here, because this is on top, right, upper, which instruct cells of the spinal cord, right, so send information down the spinal cord to move muscles. So they're directed. There's a premotor, all right, area, which is thinking about movement, so the planning. A prefrontal area, which is a vast amount of our brains as humans. So again, all of this is the frontal lobe, but this is the actual, this precentral gyrus is where we find what we call the primary motor cortex, and then areas in here would be the premotor cortex, and then all the way in the front is a prefrontal. And this is an area of the brain that is involved in motivation and our personality. It's involved in memory, right? What happened last time I did that kind of thing, and consciousness, right? The parietal, and I say here again, the frontal and parietal are separated by a central sulcus, so a groove, right? And so precentral, postcentral. Precentral is part of the frontal, and postcentral is part of the parietal. The parietal is our, right, what we call the primary somatosensation reception. So this is our primary sensory and general senses, basically. So that's what the somato means, general senses. The special senses are located in other areas of the brain. So this is your touch, pressure, itch, pain, right? Tickle, I say here, vibration, proprioception, and body movement, sensing body movement. So this is where we become aware that these things have happened. All right. The occipital, which is all the way for us in the posterior, and you guys saw this with the occipital bone. All right, this is basically, we give this vision, primary visual input. So anything that we are seeing, we're going to have to send electrical impulses back here to actually perceive or tell, sense, sight, and tell what we've seen. All right, the temporal or temporal is here on the sides, about where the ears would be located, right, where the temporal bone was. And the temporal has a few things that we can acknowledge, but one very important area is the primary auditory. So, again, primary visual cortex in the occipital, primary auditory, hearing, right, in the temporal. All right. There's also part of the limbic system, and memory is found here in the temporal or temporal lobe. All right. And then there's a few other areas too. So here, this is just showing the primary somatosensory on this cartoon, a little bit different. Primary motor. So again, this line is the central sulcus. We're going to get into this Broca's area and Wernicke's here in a little bit. And again, there's also another lobe we talk about called the insula. It's a new one, and this we consider responsible for the taste perception and sensation. So taste process in the insula. You have to kind of push the temporal aside from the frontal to see the insula. So it's kind of insulated. So that's a good word for that, right? I say the temporal lobe is separated from the rest of the cerebrum by this lateral sulcus, which is usually pretty deep, sometimes called a fissure. All right. A few other areas that are important collections, and I've already mentioned some of these. Again, here's the same cartoon. Wernicke's area is here, and it's in this area that's between the temporal and the parietal, right? Because back here is occipital. And this is an area that we call the interpretive language, and it helps us understand speech and words that we read, and helps us to choose words when we speak or communicate. Okay, so Wernicke's area, so interpretive language. All right, so Broca's, which is in the frontal lobe, right about in this area here, as I point here, is a expressive language or motor speech area. So this area is where we find neurons that help coordinate the muscles of the mouth and tongue and larynx, so that when we talk, right, we actually are going to communicate, right? We have language words that are formed, and so again, if a person suffers from aphasia, we tend to think that the Broca's area is damaged because they can't speak. So this again, this would be the expressive language area. So interpretive. And expressive. So, and above this is also an area not shown on this map specifically, where you'd find the frontal eye field, which helps control the voluntary movement of the eyes, which also help us with a number of different senses we'll talk about. Subcortical structures, the nuclei, so beneath, so here again, here's that gray matter shown here. All this is white matter, and this is all just the cerebrum we're looking at. And we've cut it. This is a frontal section, and we're cutting, we're looking in. These are ventricles, so these are spaces. And here they've kind of color-coded these different, again, the corpus callosum is actually white matter that connects the two hemispheres. This is that longitudinal fissure right here that separates the two hemispheres. All right, so there's a basal forebrain. This is where acetylcholine is produced and modulates activity, leading to the greater attention to sensory. There's a hippocampus and amygdala, where we formulate long-term memory and emotional responses. The basal nuclei, where we compare cortical processing. So in other words, basal nuclei helps us with the planning of movement. This is what is often a problem in people with Parkinson's. And there's a general activity that, again, basal nuclei help us plan our movements, right? And then the parts controlling the movement are the caudate, the putamen, and also known as the striatum, which I show you here, right, collectively, striatum. And then this globus pallidus, and that's shown here, so all this collectively. So I haven't actually asked questions about these areas of the brain on tests in the past, and I don't see myself doing that now. But these, again, these are additional areas that we can map in the brain, and we have some idea about what they are responsible for. And that's, again, a lot of what this chapter is about, is assigning responsibility and function to different areas of the entire central nervous system. All right? Association areas surround primary sensory areas, basically, and they are not part of what we consider sensory or motor, right? So they are areas which help us understand and refine the information that comes in through the sensory, and then the responses that we are going to make to that sensory. So these are basically in the cortex, again, and they are right next to these primary sensory areas, and they analyze and interpret these impulses. They help us with memory, reason, again, judgment, and emotion. So I'll give you an example again here when I say process, the visual cortex. So there's a primary visual cortex, right, in the occipital lobe, and then surrounding are association areas. And so this primary area would receive an action potential when we receive something, when we see something, right, and creates this perception. The association areas are then synapse to this, and they decide Have you seen this before? What were the circumstances that you saw this before? And do you know what you're seeing? So that's the idea of association.